Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Women Leaders, the podcast that explains global events through discussions with women experts. And welcome to ELN, the European Leadership Network, the home of this podcast. I'm Ilana Beit-El. I'm a Senior Associate Fellow at ELN, and I'm your host for this conversation with women who are leading and shaping the world in many ways and fields. Today, we're going where not many people have gone lately, and that is to Iran. Not many people, both in the sense of actually getting to Iran and not many people coming out in the street for the people of Iran. To get a better idea of what actually happened and why it's happened and where it's going, we are delighted to welcome back our very own Roxane Farmanfarmaian, an expert on Iran who has been with us many times before. Hi, Roxane. So good to see you.
Good to see you too.
As we were discussing before, just a little personal touch. How do you feel about what's happening in Iran? And are you in touch at all with people there? Have you been in touch with people who've come back from there? Give us a sense if you can.
Well, I think there's a sense for any Iranian that we've seen this series before, that people protesting against the iniquities and incompetencies of the government is something that people have done over and over again, and they often take different forms. So I think there is a sense of shared exhaustion with the people in Iran, and certainly we are seeing on the ground the effects of a crumbling economy. And the desperation people have when different aspects of their lives become consistently more difficult and more expensive, which, of course, was the first trigger for the most recent protests, but in fact have caused previous protests as well. In speaking to my family, some of whom are still in Iran, very few, but some, and some who were there during the protests but were able to leave, I think I myself suffered from some misconceptions. First of all, I thought that the airports had closed during that period, and they hadn't. And my family members were able to fly in and out, or at least say they were able to fly out. And although communication was difficult, calls being made from abroad into the country, particularly to landlines, were effective. It was a means of communications. As long as one was on the phone saying, yes, please call me again tomorrow morning, there was a consistent communication, which I think, again, had been somewhat differently presented in the media. And that meant that the people didn't feel quite so isolated, and also that they were understanding what was happening in the media outside as things were proceeding inside. So there were many elements that I think, it's not that it was better or worse, but that it was just simply a different kind of presentation when it really came to the people on the ground.
That's very interesting. I think this is also generational, probably. Most of the reporters had only ever been probably using mobile phones or internet or digital means. So the idea that a landline works is
Yeah.
like, what's a landline?
Well, I think in Iran, there certainly are landlines in most houses, and certainly one of the things that was quite interesting about this set of protests is, anyway, it was reported that they took place all over the country, and also in very smaller areas, smaller towns, and even in rural villages. And so I think in many of those places, phone was available, and those landlines are operating.
Very, very interesting, but it's good to know that you were in touch with people. The real issue, though, is the huge amount of people killed. It does seem to be difficult to assess. I've read several articles. I'm sure you know a lot more, but clearly we're talking about a significant amount of people who have been killed.
Certainly, according to the government itself, which released an interesting list of the people they considered had died and were identified, which was a departure from previous times and has been credited to the promises and leadership of the current reform president, Pezeshkian. There were definitely over 2,000, slightly less than 3,000, and they also called on the people to let the government know as long as they could provide definitive identity, because they wanted to honor each, as this is what they said, the government said in its announcement, in its list, they wanted to honor every Iranian that had died, because every Iranian was, in effect, Iran, which was an interesting way of putting it. This has been contested by many of the main human rights organizations outside of Iran. But that, of course, leads to a conundrum, because how are they gathering their information? The government, for its part, was very clear that it was looking at identity numbers, passports, driver's licenses, this kind of thing. Um, we do not have that kind of confirmation on the part of human rights groups outside of the country, so it's quite difficult to know where their numbers are coming from. And on top of that, I think it's quite difficult to know if there aren't political groups that are vested in providing international human rights groups higher numbers in order to overthrow the regime, if you will, or to attempt to. So the issue, I think, is, where does truth lie? And of course, that has consistently been the situation on the streets in Iran, and was particularly acute this time. I think every real Iran watcher felt that the protests were quite different this time than they'd ever been. So, for example, even the government's numbers indicated about 4 to 5 times as many people were killed as during the Women Life Freedom demonstrations, and further, that a good percentage of that, over 15%, were members of the security forces, and that simply has never occurred. The security forces that were identified as having died, well, you can imagine if there were 250 security forces that were killed in England or in the United States or in Germany,
Be
that would have been huge, and the government would have responded heavily.
Yeah, but if I may, I'm quoting here an opinion article in the New York Times by Scott Anderson. He said that in the city of Rasht, for example, the nominally reliable human rights activist news agency has documented at least 392 deaths. If that many were killed in Rasht, with a population of some 766,000, what might it reveal about the numbers in Tehran, population 10 million, and the epicenter of the protests? Civilians across the country have reported mass graves, morgues overflowing with body bags, relatives or neighbors disappearing without a trace. So, that clearly a lot of people are dead.
Yes, a very lot of people are dead, and I think there have been various statements on the part of different bodies, including the EU, that have now processed the terrorism designation for the Islamic
Revolutionary Guards.
Revolutionary Guards. It is something, however, it's a difficult conundrum, because you can imagine that, yes, 2,000 people, 3,000 people, maybe 6,000 people, which are some of the numbers that are used, have been killed internally. But the Iranian media clearly has the opportunity to then turn and say, well, why didn't the EU designate the Israeli Defense Force for killing 70,000, which it has admitted? So in Gaza, always to a sense of feeling as though the Iranian case is specific and that they're being judged on a different,
Well, first of all, what I would say is that, many feel that the exact opposite, that how come nobody has come out for Iran? The streets are not exactly sagging across the world with people protesting for the people of Iran. The second thing is that the Iranians were killing their own people as opposed to being involved in a war with other people. So I would say that those two are quite different. But I think that if there is a special case with Iran, it is that nobody really understands the country and a lot of people have never been there before. But this is about a regime killing its own people. This is not about an interstate war in any way, shape, or form.
In any event, it's something that within Iran is considered, and I think this is one of the things that's important to understand, as always using a separate measuring stick. And I think they feel as though that's the case with the nuclear issue and a number of other significant issues. And so it's part of the image and the narrative of Iran that I think is important to understand in terms of what at least the regime adopts. And I think is part and parcel, therefore, of how the people themselves have to measure what is true and what is not. Of course, that's something we all are struggling with these days, misinformation and disinformation. And it's rife in Iran as well. And I think there is a sense of isolation and feeling as though it's consistently addressed and has to deal with the rules of a pariah as opposed to simply as a state that is, managing its affairs without external intervention. Let's put it that way.
But let me push back on you on this one, which is that in this particular case, it's clear that this is the people versus the regime. In what way do you feel, or do you think the people want to be put in the same tub, if you want to put it that way, as the regime? The issue here is clearly the regime as opposed to the people and Iran in itself.
Again, I think that's a bit blurry, and I appreciate you bringing this up because I think certainly the people feel as though they can be against the regime for many of the things that it's done. And there are fewer and fewer that feel as though it relies on significant legitimacy in its presentation of governance. On the other hand, I think there is an extremely strong feeling, well expressed on the streets in Iran, that they do not want outside interference of any kind. And that simply is not being heard. And I think that's being folded into this idea that, oh, well, if only they had help from outside, then everything could be started again. And I think there is a sense within Iran that they're very worried about any kind. Within the government itself, one of the things that came up was to present the threat on the streets as tied into the same war that occurred in June 2025. Both Israel and the U.S. attacked Iran. And so much of the narrative tied the two together. This was just a continuation of the same war. And I think there was a concern on the part of people in Iran that these protests were more violent than protests that we've seen ever before in Iran, particularly after January 8th. There were picture after picture of the streets with burning cars and flares being thrown at buildings. We've never seen that. This was new. And the people in Iran had a demonstration after things calmed down. Now we can talk about whether they should have calmed down the way they did. But the fact of the matter was, at a certain point, peace was restored to the streets. And there was a new demonstration that, of course, the regime described as pro-regime. But in fact, and it was a large one, it wasn't pro-regime. It was people that were really worried about chaos gripping the streets. And they do recognize that one of the few ways that chaos can be avoided is to maintain a security system that will maintain security in the place as change can possibly be engineered from below. And I think if it's really going to be a people-driven change, which is better than bombing from the outside, the issue has to be accepted, I think, that, well, therefore, this regime has to remain in place at least long enough that chaos doesn't grip the streets and civil war break out.
Civil war, to an extent, are breaking out?
Why? Could I ask why you asked that question?
Yes, because, as you said, these are extremely violent protests. They're not the first protest. They may be, as you've noted, more violent. But you now have protests happening much more frequently than, 2 to 3 years, as appeared to be the case before.
I see the reason for your question, and I would answer it in two ways. One, although, I think at its height, we were told there were there were hundreds of thousands, if not, many hundreds of thousands, perhaps 1 million people in the streets across the country at the height of the protests. There are 90 million people living in Iran. That is 1/90th of the people. And so I think one of the important things is to try to determine, which is not easy for any of us, what do those other 80 million people think, And so they weren't in this. So I think it's important to recognize that no, it's not so I would answer your question. No, it's not a civil war because there are just not enough people in the streets and it's not sustained. So one of the things that I drew from my own experience, having been in the streets of Tehran during the revolution of 1979, 78 to 79, was that was a sustained set of demonstrations.
Hmm.
Every week there was something going on. Almost every day there seemed to be things going on all over the country, and it was accompanied by strikes. So one of the things I look for is, are these demonstrations and protests accompanied by strikes? And the key strike, of course, would be the oil industry, which went on strike quite early on during the events of the 1979 revolution. And this was not the case here.
Hmm.
The oil industry did not cut the lifeline of economic um, revenue to the government. And so I think those are the key elements that determine whether there's any kind of civil war or even a revolutionary convergence of different groups coming together to overthrow the regime. And I think the other element in terms of whether it's a civil war is that the narrative inside Iran really does tend to focus on the economy. And that is not a revolution
No.
sparking issue. The issue is we need a better economy. And in fact, in talking to some people in Iran and others that speak to further contacts in Iran, I think it's surprising often that we hear that some Iranians don't necessarily have the aspiration of democracy. What they do is they're looking across the Gulf at a place like Saudi and going, we would love that situation. We would love to educate our kids, to travel, to have some extra money, to have foreigners coming in, to have foreign materials and cool toys. That's what they'd like. And if there's some guy at the top who's a little bit more benevolent, fine. So I think we have to realize there are many forms of what aspiration can take. And civil war is one of the forms that I think in Iran they really recognize would not be a good step in trying to increase the value of their lifestyle and the futures for their children. What they need is something a lot more constructive that comes from greater commercial possibilities, for example. So I think what they want is the lifting of sanctions. I think that's what it always comes down to, is sanctions are killing this country and they want them lifted. And I think the greatest disappointment is on the part of the people, and I'll stop this long thing, is they would like the regime to make compromises so they can get back on track. And the regime is not compromising.
Right. I mean, I think that's a very, very interesting position. I would only point out to you, though, again, as an onlooker, I have no idea, but the issue with the headscarves wasn't economic. The protests over headscarves 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I can't remember precisely, that wasn't economic, but it was very big.
Yeah, that was 2022, and that was definitely a women's driven. And you're absolutely right, Ilana. That was one of the more unusual ones. And there are unusual ones. There are ones sometimes by students. There are sometimes there are definitely other triggers. That one, however, I think also reflects the very narrow, but nonetheless degree of flexibility that the government is willing to allow. So it is never agreed that women don't have to wear headscarves. But the fact remains, if you look at many of the demonstrations in this particular set of protests, women aren't wearing them anymore. And
Mm,
certainly the family that I have that go back and forth, several of which are women, don't wear them anymore. And they say it's amazing. I mean, it's amazing. And
mm,
so the regime has simply turned its head. And that is something it's willing to do on things that are not absolutely fundamental to it. And I think one of the elements that's worth thinking about is that in many ways, this whole Islamic bit that we think of as the Islamic Republic, in a sense, died with the original introducer of this concept, which was Khomeini. And when the current supreme leader, Khamenei, took over, he in many ways just simply established a dictatorship and adopted many of these Islamic superficial directives as something similar to what Gaddafi adopted for the Green Book, or that we see in
right.
It is really not an Islamic regime in the sense it's recognized by Islamic scholarship. And that's why so many people in Iran, it's one of the least religious populations in the Middle East. And for that reason.
That's very interesting. So how would you define, I mean, I know we've discussed this in the past, you and I, but how would you define the regime in that case for the onlooker very briefly so that we can move?
I think it's a very much a dictatorship, an autocracy led by an extremely rigid and ruthless Ayatollah in this particular case. I think it was significant that when he took over, he wasn't even an Ayatollah. The whole point was supposed to be leadership by the most enlightened Islamic leader. He didn't fit that. And so politics had already introduced their head into the situation. And he had been the one in many ways that began the whole Revolutionary Guard. He was the founder and the organizer of the original Revolutionary Guard. And they supported him. And so it's been a regime that's in many ways a military regime that has increasingly become so. Their share of the budget, the economy is enormous, which is one of the reasons they have not abandoned the regime. They are the regime.
They are the regime. And they're very rich. Presumably they
They are
take a
quite
lot.
rich. They've taken over many significant economic sectors, a little bit like the military in Egypt. This is not an unusual situation in terms of military dictatorships. They have a front man and several clerical leaders that support this as though it has got the divine stamp of approval. In many ways, they are the ones that also have the nuclear program in the majority under their umbrella. And they are spread across the country. I mean, it's a vast organization. So that's, I think, one of the real difficulties that people are facing in the policy circles of the West is even to remove Khamenei, the supreme leader, probably would not make a huge difference to the regime, and yet the attack in June 2025 included decapitating more than 25 members of the top levels of the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard. And that didn't seem to have made any difference. And if anything, younger people have moved in, ones that have fought in Syria and in Iraq, and they're more rigid than their older, possibly more experienced predecessors. So we have a more radicalized group.
Rigid in what?
I think in favor of supporting the Islamic Republic the way it is organized today.
So do they work in parallel from what you're saying? Is there also a civil service in Iran, or is this it?
No, you are absolutely right to point that out. There is a civil service in Iran. There's a whole parallel governance. That's the president, Majlis, which is the parliament. There are cabinet members, and certainly it is the foreign minister right now who is gearing up to speak to the Trump administration over the nuclear negotiations in Oman. So each has their own domains, but the ultimate decider, if you will, is the supreme leader and his vast executive office, Khamenei.
And that is effectively the Revolutionary Guards.
Well, the Revolutionary Guards are part and parcel of it. They are not parallel. They are integrated into this mechanism.
Into Khamenei's mechanism.
The supreme leader's mechanism.
Yeah, but they're not integrated into the civil service.
Well, yes, they are. They're everywhere. So there are members of parliament that are from the Revolutionary Guard. In fact, the previous prime minister, Ahmadinejad, who was quite a character, he was from the Revolutionary Guard. The current head of the parliament, speaker of the parliament, was previously a general of the Revolutionary Guard. No, it is integrated throughout the system, both parallel mechanisms.
Roxane, I think that one of the things that for many people is unclear is, before we look ahead, is looking back. 2025, you've mentioned several times the war in June, but it was a difficult year in general in the region and for Iran specifically. Can you maybe have a look at that and explain to us briefly what it is that affected Iran so badly, culminating in the war?
And I think that likewise, the level of sanctions really took a particularly sharp bite that year. So the country currency dropped and it felt more isolated. So I think the culmination was in some ways the war in June. And I feel as though in some ways the regime had hoped for greater support from Russia and China in that particular incident, which they didn't receive. So they felt more isolated on a geopolitical sphere. On the other hand, there has been an interesting development in the Gulf itself. Ever since the Chinese brokered a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia back in 2022, I think it was, there has been a different feeling within the Gulf, and that it is a neighborhood, and that the states within the Gulf, particularly Iran and Saudi Arabia, that were at loggerheads, are recognizing that they are not going anywhere and they're all there near abroad. And so there has been greater support for bringing some degree of peace to the membership within the Gulf. And that has been a complementary positive for Iran, which feels now as though at least its neighbors are having an eye out for the regional benefit, because it's a very hostile neighborhood that they're all in. And I think the loss of its associated partners led to a recalibration on the part of Iran. Part of that had already been triggered by this rapprochement between Saudi and Iran, in which one of the requirements was that support for these partners be reduced, and certainly to have them stop attacking Saudi and the UAE, other states. So I think there was overall a recalibration taking place in Iran. And I think it's feeling now as though it has to refocus and to rethink. So this brings us to its position in the nuclear deal, where I think it's got support by China and Russia in developing a deal. I think their voices are part of the frame. And I think also Saudi and the UAE and Qatar are part of the frame. So this has changed from the negotiations of the first round, where it was really the Europeans and the Americans. Now we have a neighborhood, and a larger neighborhood, because of course Russia shares a large abroad with Iran, a multilateral set of negotiations, in fact, are part of this. And I think that means that the future has some hope that possibly sanctions can be at least reduced. The nuclear program at least could be reduced, which all of us would like to see. During the previous deal, actually, enrichment dropped from 60% to zero. And I think that's what we would really like to see happen again as a world. We don't want to see more nuclear activity in the Gulf. So this is, for me, the area where I have the greatest hope that things may shift, and also that more contributors are part of this, so it becomes a much more multilateral agreement.
I think that's a very, very interesting perspective on it. We are speaking on the day in which, or the day before, we're recording this on the 5th of February, just as a matter of interest, the day in which the START Treaty ends, which
Right.
is bad news nuclear-wise. Let us be absolutely clear about that. That is the agreement between the US and Russia, which has held for a very long time, but even though Russia unilaterally announced that it was no longer in it, this is when it absolutely
Yeah.
expires today.
Yeah.
And that's bad for everyone. I take your point on the Gulf. I would add on the Gulf, though, that we haven't mentioned the Houthis, who very much are supported by Iran and have very much influenced international shipping.
I didn't mention them primarily, Ilana, because they have not experienced a setback while the other sets have. They are supported by Iran, undoubtedly, but they also exhibit an independence that is a constant thorn in the side of Iran. So it's not a completely controlling situation, let's put it that way.
Right. If we were to look ahead, Roxane, I think that if I'm taking everything that you're saying, we're looking ahead at an unclear, but in a sense, what you're suggesting is best possible outcome at this point in time is whether the people in Iran agree or disagree, the best possible outcome is some form of nuclear agreement, because that would remove the sanctions.
That is absolutely right. I think the other scenario that would fit as part of that is not to have perhaps an accidental devolution into war where the huge armada sitting off of Iran's coast in the Gulf by the United States would engage in kinetic attacks. And I think that's something that horrifies Iran and I think the rest of us, because we're very concerned that that could really finally develop into a regional war, which everyone is concerned about. And it would affect, of course, the rest of the world because so much oil and other energy supplies come out of that region. So I think we're hoping that something can be achieved both at the negotiating table and inside Iran, possibly through a success at the negotiating table that would then enable the economy to start improving. And once that would occur, then it's undoubted that some of the corruption that the sanctions have contributed to on the part of the government would probably lessen, and probably people could get on with trying to improve the political situation. I think nothing will change until the supreme leader himself is either removed or dies. He's very old and frail. However, he's already lived quite a bit longer than many of the Iran watchers thought he might. And I think a new leader or a new group at the head, although perhaps not changing the fundamental pillars of the government, would nonetheless bring in new faces and new decision making. And I think the world will look at it somewhat differently. Now, whether that is in the next 24 hours or the next 10 years, unfortunately, we just don't know.
That for sure we don't know. I think the two things we do know, which we haven't mentioned, I feel the need that we should just go there. One of them is, of course, to my mind at least, it's very impressive, at least to the Americans themselves, to have this huge armada. But I'm constantly at a loss to understand what they could hit. Are you you're going to take out the supreme leader? You're going to take out the headquarters of the Revolutionary Guards? I mean, what is the target? And I think that is very.
That's the question, right? That is it, Ilana. It's not, Iran is not Venezuela. The flush of, success that Trump had with that, certainly the first armada he put together and now feels as though it's, an opportunity to use elsewhere, was a country where the capital was right next to the coast, where there was a very small group that had a number of people in it that had already done back channel deals with Rubio, Foreign Minister Rubio and Secretary of State Rubio in the United States, and there was already a plan. In Iran, it's a totally different situation. There is no obvious cracks in the government. The capital is thousands of miles from the coast. The coast itself is riddled with drone and missile silos that could easily attack anything that's sitting in the Gulf. And there is no one to make a back corridor deal with. So, and the worry, I think, the real worry that any of us that are from Iran feel is it has so many extraordinary World Heritage monuments, which Trump had in his first term threatened to attack. And I think we're worried they're going to be, at risk. And we've seen the rubble that has been, created across the Middle East in Syria and in Lebanon and elsewhere, and Iraq. We're worried. There is no obvious place to attack.
I think that's a very correct worry. My last question would be, and this goes back to right at the very beginning, taking on your point as to what it is that the people who went out to protest, what they were seeking. Nonetheless, do you think that there is a disappointment that so few international protests in support of the people of Iran are taking place?
It's a difficult one to know. I mean, I do know that there were a number of protests. There was, one I was just reading about in Toronto and another in Geneva that a cousin of mine attended. And there certainly were ones in London in the United States. I think there is a sense of futility to some degree that these are having an effect. But the other goes back to, I think, the idea abroad that the diaspora is very divided. And in fact, different groups within the diaspora have threatened each other. And so I think there's quite a bit of concern that there is risk on the streets if you go out to demonstrate. And this is, I think, a feature of the fact that the Iranian Revolution back in 1979 was one of the two great revolutions in the 20th century, the other one being Russian. And if you look at the diaspora of the Russian, it too was deeply divided. And so maybe that's one of the spin-offs of revolution. There are few of them. They're rare. They're difficult. They're big. They're sustained. But one of the impacts is those who lose and have to leave become highly divided. And I think we saw this very much during the women life freedom demonstrations. The diaspora was vicious towards each other. So I think there's an element of that that's now hampering demonstrations to support that which is going on in Iran. And in any event, so often we've noticed those demonstrations don't really parallel in terms of language and message what is happening in Iran. So it's really useful, I think, and important for those on the outside to listen to what the people in Iran are saying, because that in the end are the 90 million people or 1 million of the 90 million that are there.
I think that's a fabulous and important message with which to end this fabulous and important conversation. Roxane Farmanfarmaian, thank you so very much. And of course, I would note that Roxane, very much like me, is a Senior Associate Fellow of the European Leadership Network. That's a wrap on this episode of Women Leaders. Keep listening to our conversations and support us with a subscription on your podcast platform. Leave us a 5-star on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And of course, add to the conversation with your comments. In addition, help support our podcast and spread the happy word of this episode to friends, colleagues, enemies, family, and anyone you think would like it. We're on all media, so reach out on Instagram as @women_leaders_podcast and on ELN, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. All information and links mentioned in the episode can be found in the notes. I'm Ilana Beit-El, together with my friend and producer, Florence Ferrando, and we'll be back very soon with another great conversation.